A woman's body was discovered in her bedroom. Her two sons, who shared a home with her, were oblivious to what was happening. Detectives began their investigation, but they were unable to identify the offender. Nobody was ready for the truth that emerged when the case finally made progress after 38 years.
Welcome to A to Z Crime Stories. Before we start, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more.
In 1950, Linda Slatton was born in Alabama, USA, to devoted parents and a younger sister named Judy. Linda showed kindness and ambition from a young age. She always made an effort to assist others, which gained her a lot of friends. She later got married to a man with whom she had two sons, Jeff and Tim, was Frank. But as time passed, their marriage grew more and more troubled. Frank started abusing his wife and kids after becoming an alcoholic. Linda eventually left and made the decision to relocate to Florida with her sons. They made their home in Lakeland, the city where Linda's parents and sister had previously resided. Linda rented a home in a neighborhood by the lake and spent her entire day working to support her sons. Although Linda worked a variety of jobs, she struggled with money. She occasionally had to sell her possessions in order to pay the bills. Her older son Jeff had to ride his bicycle to school because she couldn't even afford to buy him a car. Despite the financial difficulties, her younger son Tim was a football player and frequently had to ask his coach for a ride home after practice to avoid walking. Linda always made an effort to spend as much time and energy as she could with her sons. She took them on hikes, brought them to concerts featuring their favorite bands, and generally worked to make sure their childhood was full of happy memories. When Linda was 31 years old, on September 3, 1981, she waited for Jim to finish his practice before accompanying him to the neighbor's house where a small family gathering was being held. However, there wasn't much food in the fridge when Jeff got home and wanted to eat dinner. As a result of his frustration with his mother, he got on his bike and rode to the other side of the city to visit his grandparents. After everyone had returned home, Jeff and his mother got into a fight over the empty fridge, but they eventually came to an agreement. The following morning, Linda's sister, who also lived in the building, went to her home to extend an invitation for a cup of coffee. When Linda didn't answer the door when she knocked, she assumed that she had left. The woman noticed the bedroom window was open as she turned around and prepared to leave. When she got close, she peered inside and saw Linda sprawled out on the bed. The woman screamed immediately after that and ran to the neighbors to ask them to call the police. She only needed to glance at her sister's face. Detectives arrived at their home and started looking at the crime scene before she realized she was dead. With a wire hanger around her neck, Linda's clothes were partially pulled down as she lay on her bed. Using this information, the police surmised that the victim had been attacked and strangled by an unidentified man who had broken into her room. This theory was soon supported by the discovery of a palm print on the windowsill by forensic experts. Since the apartment lacked air conditioning, Linda frequently left it open, making it simple for the murderer to enter. The victim's oldest son awoke from the commotion as the detectives worked at the crime scene. The detectives took him outside and broke the heartbreaking news of his mother's passing. They then roused his younger brother and let him out of the room. But as the boy passed by his mother's room at that precise moment, another policeman came out. Tim froze in place when he saw his mother's body through the open door and had to be pulled away by the officer. Tim was 12 years old and Jeff was 15 years old. Were utterly shocked. They initially found it difficult to accept that their mother had passed away. When the investigators were able to speak with them later, the brother claimed that despite having their own rooms, they hadn't heard any noise and hadn't even woken up that night. Given the excellent acoustics of the building and the brutality of the murder, the detectives thought loud noises should have been audible from the victim's room. The neighbors, who also had not heard anything, were questioned by the police. None of the complex's residents reported seeing any shady characters that day. After examining the victim's body, medical professionals concluded that she had experienced violence. Although they removed the killer's biological components, they were unable to perform a DNA analysis at the time. The experts also determined that Linda had been strangled to death, leaving the detectives to look into the case with little to no evidence. If they were able to identify a suspect and make a comparison, the palm print could only be of assistance. The Grands moved in with Linda's sons. They never recovered from their shock and lived in constant fear of being pursued by the killer. They slept in the same room as their grandmother due to their extreme fear, and their grandfather kept a rifle in the living room. The detectives thought the kids weren't in any real danger, though. They believed that the murderer knew the victim and that the crime had only a sexual motivation. They learned about Linda's ex-husband after speaking with her family. He was the obvious suspect because he had a history of domestic abuse, but the police soon discovered that he was out of state when the victim was killed. Later, the detectives learned that Linda had begun dating a particular man not long before she passed away. Although they found him, he also had a strong alibi. The investigators ran fingerprint checks on each of the victim's neighbors and compared them to the sample taken from the windowsill. Then, they made a comparable analysis of all previously convicted men living in Lakeland, but there were no matches. The family eventually decided that Linda's son's return to school would be the best course of action for them after several weeks had passed since the murder. The brothers eventually started talking to friends again and started leading more normal lives, so it did help them. Tim rejoined the football team because his mother had always been pleased with his performance. He hung a picture of his team in his bedroom a month after she passed away as a reminder of the lessons his mother had taught him about pursuing his dreams and moving forward. The detectives, meanwhile, ran into a brick wall. They searched for a suitable suspect but were unsuccessful, so they decided to start over and think about why the sons hadn't heard any screams or seen any indications of a struggle. When the police went over Jeff's statements, they saw that he had a disagreement with Linda on the day that she was killed. In addition, the teen had admitted to the detectives that he and his mother frequently had arguments, which caused the investigators to wonder. He had murdered his mother, Jeff. They called him in for questioning and resumed their barrage of inquiries. Jeff soon became aware that the police were looking into him for the crime. The detectives persisted in pressing him despite his denial of his involvement. Jeff accepted their offer to take a polygraph test. Although the polygraph operator found no evidence of deception, the police were not willing to give up. Soon after, they planned to bring in a hypnotist to put a man under again for questioning. Trance stayed under constant pressure. Jeff was accused of strangling his mother by the investigators. When Linda's family reached their breaking point over this, they yelled at the police to concentrate on finding the real killer and forbade them from speaking to Jeff. Despite this, Jeff consented to take another polygraph test, and following positive results, he was finally cleared of suspicion. The case remained unresolved after that for many years. Jeff and Tim developed, obtained jobs, and the murder of their mother continued to trouble them as they started their own families, but each time they contacted the detectives, they got the same response: no progress has been made in the case. Professionals took a DNA sample from the victim's biological material in March 1999. A new detective brought in to work on the case 2 years later compared it to samples from every suspect, including Linda's 2 sons, but there were no matches. Nothing came from even cross-referencing it with the FBI database. Jeff had a meeting with this detective when they were aware that they had known each other for a long time. The men were discovered to frequently bowl together with shared friends. During their conversation, the detective assured Jeff that he would crack the case no matter what. Tim and Jeff learned of another long-standing crime that had not yet been solved. Following extensive media coverage, fresh information surfaced that enabled the culprit to be apprehended. The brothers then made the decision to approach reporters and share their. They gave a thorough interview, and the story was published in the neighborhood newspapers in September 2001. When the detective discovered that Jimmy Ulmer, who had been sentenced to 80 years in prison for killing Linda, had kidnapped a young woman through her bedroom window a year prior, he had an intriguing new lead. It was made even more intriguing by the fact that, at the time of Linda's murder, this individual lived in the same apartment building only a few meters from her home. When Homer was detained, the DNA of. Since it did not yet exist, criminals had not yet been added to a shared database. The biological samples of the man himself were lost after his death in 1996. However, when the detective got in touch with the offender's mother, she gave the experts access to a number of personal items from which the sample could be obtained. Sadly, it did not match the killer's DNA, but the detective was not prepared to give up despite the setback. He kept looking for new suspects and repeatedly requested that the FBI run the killer's DNA sample through all. Kept in touch with Linda's sons and used the databases that were available. Sadly, he had health issues in 2015, which made him retire despite his vow to see the case through to the end. At that point, Jeff and Tim had all but given up hope of ever catching the person who had killed their mother. A new hope, however, surfaced in 2019 when C.C. Moore, a well-known authority on genetic ancestry, accepted the case. She collected the murderer's DNA sample, uploaded it to open databases, and started looking for any matches. Typically, these databases can even assist in locating the DNA owner's most distant relatives, who may be spread out across the globe and not even be aware of one another's existence. It is possible to trace their family tree using this information and identify shared ancestors. After all this laborious work, filter out thousands of relatives and identify the DNA owner. One family that was present in the area at the time of the murder was identified by Moore. She came to the conclusion that he was very likely the murderer because there was only one member of that family who met all the criteria. The detectives knew as soon as they heard his name that they had come across him in previous reports. Tim's football coach, Joseph Clinton Mills, frequently gave him a ride home from practice. He was never listed as a suspect, but the police had taken a statement over the incident in 1981, so he had left Tim at home that day and was calling because of it. At the time, none of the detectives even gave Mills' potential role as the murderer any thought. The police did not compare his DNA and fingerprints with the evidence collected at the crime scene because he was only 20 years old and there was zero evidence against him. The detectives decided to wait before telling Jeff and Tim about this finding. They needed to confirm that Mills was really responsible for killing their mother. They discovered after reading his biography that when Mills was detained in 1984 on suspicion of forging a will, his fingerprints were taken, and they are still preserved in a paper archive today. They were a perfect match when experts compared them to the fingerprints discovered on the victim's window sill. They identified the likely murderer at last after 38 years. The detectives then proceeded to the last step, which involved taking a DNA sample from Mills and comparing it with the biological material from the victim's body. They learned the man was still alive. The same residence as in 1981. 58 years old, married, with a small business, kids, and grandchildren, Mills was now. For several weeks, the detectives kept an eye on him in an effort to find something that contained his DNA. It might have been a bottle, a coffee cup, a cigarette butt, etc. However, they were never given the chance, so the police made the decision to covertly take his trash. They gave the bag to the lab, where specialists soon discovered something that contained his DNA. The results for Mills' DNA were quick to come in. The detectives then met with their sons to update them on the case's development. Both of them were astounded, but Tim found it much harder to accept. He couldn't believe that the man who had murdered his mother turned out to be his football coach. Tim respected and looked up to Mills, and even after the murder, Mills still gave Tim rides home from practice. He was constantly applauded by the man, who also inquired about any obstacles. Tim's old bedroom featured a football team photo with the killer of his mother standing behind him. Tim had been following the developments in his mother's case for years. When Mills was detained in the same year, he maintained composure and didn't even inquire as to the charges against him. He denied any involvement when questioned about Linda's murder after being brought in for questioning. He claims to have dropped Tim off and then left. Although Mills insisted he had never been inside their home, the detectives were aware that this was a lie. Informed him of the DNA and fingerprint match, the suspect abruptly changed his account of what happened. As of late, Mills has maintained that Linda invited him to enter her bedroom through the window that evening for an intimate encounter. She then requested that he lightly choke her with a hanger, but Mills misjudged his strength and killed her. Given all the available information, the detectives of course didn't believe this story for a second. They had a much more logical theory based on the fact that Mills had. Tim was frequently given rides home. He had seen his mother and might have chosen her as a target. He dropped the boy off the evening of the murder, and he went right away with his mother to a party at the neighbor's house. The returned on foot, sneaking into Linda's bedroom through the window and hiding in the closet. Mills took advantage of the fact that no one would be at home in their house and drove away for a short distance. He waited in that same closet for several hours as everyone fell asleep. He assaulted the victim, then took a hanger and used it as a murder weapon before fleeing out the window. Charges for the murder were filed against Mills based on all the evidence, and the case was sent to court in the state of Florida. On February 9, 2022, Mills made the decision to reach a plea agreement with the prosecution in order to avoid the death penalty, which was a potential punishment for such a crime. He admitted to the murder, but according to the terms of the deal, he was not required to reveal the specifics of the. In the courtroom, Linda's sons expressed their displeasure with this fact. Tim yelled at his coach, demanding to know why he had taken his mother away from him, but the man remained silent, only looking down when given the chance to make a closing argument. "I'm a good person," Mills declared. "They are trying to portray me as something I'm not." The brothers were even more incensed by this, but in the end they were appreciative of the detectives for solving the case and catching the murderer. Mills was given a life sentence. Jeff and Tim made a promise to try to live honorable lives and devote themselves to their families after the verdict was announced, as that is what their mother would have wanted. Share your opinion on this story in the comments and don't forget to like it. Thanks for watching. A young lady was discovered inside her own apartment. Police launched an investigation but came up empty-handed. It took 40 years for a breakthrough to be made in the case, but in addition to the truth, the detectives also learned new, alarming information. On March 30, 1960, Robin Brooks was born in Virginia. She relocated with her family to the sleepy New York town of Highland when she was a young girl. Robin was a happy and outgoing person who always managed to make friends and find common ground with others. Mariah, her older sister, was someone she was very close to. Robin decided to relocate to California after graduation. The young woman had another compelling reason to relocate in addition to the state's climate. Shortly before that, her sister had also moved there, and Robin had made the decision to join her. The young lady obtained employment in Sacramento and rented an apartment there. A few months later, she got the chance to relocate to the apartment building where her sister and her boyfriend were housed. The apartments were vastly superior. So that Robin could spend more time with Mariah, Robin decided to relocate just before turning 20. The young woman had to work 2 jobs in order to pay the rent on her separate apartment, one of which was a cashier position at a donut shop just a few meters away from her apartment building. Robin decided to combine it with her second job by working the evening shift. The young woman made a lot of friends during her time living in this complex, which lasted about 1.5 months. She was happy to be able to see her sister again at work and other times as well. At the donut shop on April 24, 1980, Robin was scheduled to begin her shift at 4 p.m., but to the surprise of her co-workers, she never arrived. She never missed her chefs while she was employed there, and she frequently arrived even earlier than expected, so this was very odd. After waiting for several hours, one of the workers made the decision to visit Robin's apartment. Only one person answered the door when the co-worker knocked on it. Observation and reaction: he returned this door and informed them that the young woman was not responding after making several unsuccessful attempts. Because of this, Robin's co-workers were very worried because they believed that if something had happened to her, she would have called to explain why she couldn't come to work. She had made friends with every employee in the brief time she had worked there, and they were all genuinely concerned about her. They thought about contacting the police, but quickly realized that they wouldn't look for. One of them came up with an unconventional solution after Robin missed a shift at work. He offered to open the door to her apartment and see how she was doing. He and his co-workers went to her house, remained at the door for a while, and then made the decision to break in. When they were successful, they witnessed a startling scene. In the living room, where Robin was lying on her water bed, blood was all over the place. As soon as her co-workers called the police, officers arrived. Confirmed the young lady's demise. She appeared to have suffered numerous stab wounds from an unidentified attacker who attacked her with a knife and repeatedly pierced the water mattress, causing its contents to spill onto the floor. Police determined after investigating the crime scene that there were no indications of a break-in before Robin's co-workers opened the entrance door. They assumed that the killer entered the apartment through a window because the back door was also locked from the inside. Soon, forensic specialists discovered proof of. According to this theory, medical examiners were able to establish the victim's sexual assault through the discovery of fingerprints on the windowsill and obtain the offender's biological material. Additionally, there are minute amounts of blood in the apartment that do not match Robin's blood type. Blood samples were sent to a lab after detectives determined that the attacker had cut himself during the attack. Unfortunately, they were unable to use this evidence because DNA analysis was not available in the 1980s. Investigators started speaking with the victim's friends, starting with her co-workers, claimed that the young woman had finished her shift the day before at midnight and gone home. She was acting normally, laughing, and in a good mood. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. That particular day, Robin mentioned to her co-workers that she had washed her bedding before leaving for work and was unsure if it would dry in time for her return. Detectives deduced that the victim's apartment's bed wasn't made. Shortly after she got home, the murderer attacked her. Her sister also made a worrying report. Robin mentioned that she was being followed by a man a few days before she passed away. She didn't give any information that could be used to identify him, but she did say that he had frequented her store and acted in an odd way in an effort to win her favor. Robin did not take it seriously because he had not done anything to make her fear for her safety. Due to a lack of information, the police were unable to identify this individual. They talked to the victim's neighbors and continued their investigation without any leads. None of them had heard any screams or sounds of struggle that night. The victim was not being visited by anyone unfamiliar, according to the neighbors. Investigators also discovered that Robin did not go straight home from work that evening. Rather, she spent some time at a party with her friends before laughing. Her friends reported that she went home alone, and that there were no disputes or unusual circumstances at the party. After speaking with everyone present, the police came to the conclusion that they were most likely not responsible for her murder. The investigators ultimately came to a standstill because they had no viable suspects. There were no people from Robin's past who might have had ill intentions toward her, and she got along well with her neighbors and co-workers. They were unable to identify the killer at the time using blood or biological evidence, and fingerprint matching against databases did not produce any results. Authorities thought that the murderer, he was the regular customer that Robin had mentioned. The victim was allegedly followed from her place of employment to her residence, where he allegedly learned her precise address. The following day, while she was waiting at the store, he broke into her apartment through a window. He attacked her, brutalized her, killed her, and then fled when Robin arrived home. The investigation went on for a while despite the complete lack of evidence before it eventually came to a standstill. 24 years after the murder, the investigation wasn't reopened by authorities until 2004. Detectives hoped that the widespread use of DNA analysis at the time would enable them to catch the murderer. They sent biological samples and blood to a lab, where specialists extracted a DNA profile and entered it into the FBI database. However, no matches were discovered. This indicated that the murderer had not previously been convicted of a serious offense or that it occurred before such offenders were required to submit to DNA collection. Despite this, the California State Database held a concerning discovery for the investigators: the DNA. The murderer's profile matched one committed 3 weeks prior to Robin's death. A different young woman was assaulted at that time in her home by an unidentified man who then left the victim alive. The incident took place at night, so the victim was unable to see the attacker's face. She dialed 911 right away, and forensic specialists were able to take the man's biological material. Detectives searched for fresh leads in this case to finally pin down Robin's killer, but they were all unsuccessful. Investigators were left periodically checking the DNA profile against databases in case the murderer was taken into custody, but they were fruitless, and eventually the case went cold once more. His DNA was added to that view. Until 2017, when detectives learned about a novel technique called DNA phenotyping, this continued. In essence, geneticists examine a DNA sample and, using their interpretation of the results, sketch a rough portrait of the suspect. This approach is not exact and is more of an additional police guideline. Investigators can closely examine similar suspects or cross someone off the list with the aid of such a portrait. Detectives contacted Paraben Nano Labs, which carried out such research, and soon they had a rough sketch of the murderer. He turned out to be a man of African descent, but among all the individuals who even remotely resembled him, investigators were unable to identify anyone similar. 2 portraits were created by Paraben Nano Labs, one depicting the suspect's potential appearance in 1980 and the other in 2016. Both pictures were released to the media in an effort to generate more leads. The family of Robin made the decision to offer a $10,000 reward for any information about this person that could lead to his discovery in the hopes of finally learning the truth. Numerous tips were given to the police, but they all proved fruitless. They were still unable to determine who the actual criminal was. However, the detectives and Robin's family weren't going to give up. This murder case was added to the list of unsolved slayings in 2020. By then, funding had been allocated, and a fresh DNA analysis tool was in use, making it possible to identify even distant relatives of the DNA sample owner. For this, at least one relative of his had to be listed in national or local DNA databases. The Paramount Nanolabs experts received the Robin killer sample and waited. It took them several months to research every potential ancestor of the criminal, track down their family trees, and then identify a suitable suspect. As a result, the investigators at last received a name. Philip Wilson, 71, was suspected of being guilty, but the research findings did not support this. To compare his DNA to the sample discovered in the victim's apartment, the police needed to take it. They discovered this man's address and started keeping an eye on him. Given that a person is not required by law to provide a DNA sample, the police must use some deception. They frequently try to obtain something the suspect has had contact with. An example of this would be a water bottle or cigarette butt. Investigators also took the same actions in Wilson's case. They obtained something containing his DNA and sent it to the lab, where scientists discovered a perfect match. They identified the suspected murderer 4 decades later, and on February 24 of that year, he was taken into custody. Although the man claimed he had nothing to do with the murder, the evidence was against him. His fingerprints were also taken by the police because they coincided with those on the victim's windowsill. The investigators examined his biography. I discovered a lot of fascinating information around the time Robin was killed. The 31-year-old man resided a short distance from her complex. In addition, Wilson frequently stopped by the victim's place of employment, a donut shop. The police's initial theory that the murderer was the same enigmatic stalker who had bothered the young woman at work was supported by this information. The lack of the man's DNA and fingerprints in the databases was explained by the fact that he had no significant criminal history. Following his arrest, the trial's preparations got underway, but they took a long time. Years passed before the process started, and it wasn't until 2022 that Wilson and his attorneys prepared a new defense theory, according to which Philip and Robin had a consensual relationship that night. After the man went home, someone else broke into the girl's apartment and killed her. Regarding the suspect's blood that was discovered at the crime scene, Wilson's attorney insisted that he had been hurt at work and that it had become infected while he was at Robin's house. The prosecution gave this version some thought. Absurdity of events. First of all, the victim was not involved in a romantic relationship with anyone. Additionally, Wilson was most likely the strange man the victim complained about stalking her at work. There was no understanding between them, and the young woman found his actions and persistence to be infuriating. It would be strange to assume that Wilson left his biological material, blood, and fingerprint while the murderer left nothing at all, given that no other men's DNA traces were discovered in the victim's apartment. Furthermore, if we accept the suspect's lawyer, she had not made the bed, which was empty of bedding, prior to reaching out to him of her own free will. Wilson's defense also made an effort to implicate Maria's ex-boyfriend, who she was living with at the time, as a potential murderer. The man was not alive at the time of the trial, but the attorney attempted to persuade the jury otherwise by claiming that he was hostile, threatened Robin and her sister, and also broke into the victim's apartment, but nothing could be proven. Confirmed, so none of these claims significantly affected the legal system. Philip Wilson was consequently found guilty of murder. On his birthday, his sentence was revealed. The man was given a life sentence with no chance of release. He currently has a lot of health issues, so his time in jail won't likely be very long. The family of the victim thanked the detectives for concluding the investigation. Her sister acknowledged that she does indeed still feel guilty. Robin followed her to California. The man received no additional punishment for that crime because the statute of limitations had already passed. Detectives continue to ponder whether Wilson had any additional victims. Typically, criminals who carry out such heinous acts and wait a few weeks before stopping don't stop and keep hurting people. Wilson might not have intended to kill Robin, he may have just broken into her apartment and assaulted her, but she was able to see and recognize him because he had previously visited her store. The man may have chosen to murder and then refrain from committing other crimes out of repeated fear of a prison sentence. Share your opinion on this story in the comments and don't forget to like it. Thanks for watching. At first, the police believed they had the answer in front of them when the student vanished as she was making her way to the dorm. But as the investigation went on, they were more and more certain that there had been many complicated circumstances in this case, and that the truth had ultimately only come to light by accident. On October 1, 1969, Amy Blau was born in Homestead, Florida. She was raised in a loving family and was well liked, largely as a result of her upbeat and charitable personality. Her father died when she was 14 years old. Despite this heartbreaking loss, passed away. After graduating from high school, Amy found the perseverance to keep a positive outlook on life. Despite the fact that Flagler College only had 13,000 residents and was located in St. Augustine, close to Jacksonville, she enrolled there. It was the oldest American city. Spanish explorers laid the foundation for it. Amy loved studying architecture at college because it has so many distinctive features that set it apart from the typical American things. There, she made a lot of friends in 3 years. She had never laughed much before and was 21 years old at the time. She and her friend Kim decided to visit a nearby bar that was well liked by college students on November 6, 1990, when Kim arrived in St. Augustine. Kelly, Amy's roommate and closest friend, joined them. The young ladies thoroughly enjoyed their long-awaited meeting. Sean Nolan, a friend of theirs, eventually joined them. He and Amy did not have a romantic relationship, but they did share sympathy. In the evening, Kim and Kelly both left, leaving Sean and Amy alone, after Kelly claimed she felt ill and returned to the dorm. The young ladies had to go to class the following morning, but when Kelly awoke, she discovered that Amy's bedroom door was wide open and that she was not in it. She thought it strange, but she made the decision to see Amy in class, but the student never appeared. Kelly and Kim were concerned about her absence and made the decision to speak with Sean, who had spent the previous night with her at the bar. The young women went to see him because he worked somewhere close to the college. They initially thought his story was strange, but he claimed to have a powerful. He had a hangover and had trouble recalling the events of that evening. He finally admitted to them after gathering his thoughts that after the bar, he and Amy went in the direction of the beach to take a walk but soon made the decision to return home. The two got into an argument as they waited for the taxi after the guy dialed a taxi from the closest payphone. She ultimately decided to walk the short distance to the dorm. Kelly was annoyed that the guy didn't take Amy to her dorm and instead left her on her own. During this time, she increased even more in. Amy never appeared in her room, and she was concerned that she had nowhere to go but the dorm. Her friend started to seriously doubt Sean because she was afraid that something terrible had happened to her. She became more anxious as a result of his strange behavior because it appeared that he was not at all concerned that Amy had vanished. Kelly made the decision to carry on looking, so she went to the college campus and asked all of her friends if they had seen Amy. The response was the same: no one had encountered her that day, and nobody was aware of her whereabouts at 6 o'clock. Her pal made the choice to make a police call. She told the detectives about the missing girl, and they started to look into the details. They contacted every hospital in the area, but nobody who resembled Amy had been admitted. The drivers of taxis were also contacted, but none had picked up the young woman that evening. There was no proof that Amy had gotten into trouble or been a victim of a crime, according to the police. The young woman was already 21 years old at the time, so despite the concern of her friend, they did not formally report her missing. Orders at that point. Kelly was positive that Amy had experienced a negative event. She made the decision to call Amy's mother after realizing she could not persuade the police to begin their search. The young lady later acknowledged that it was the most difficult call she had ever made. Amy's sister arrived in St. Augustine the following morning to help with the search. They went to the police station first, where they were met with the same response: they were unable to launch an investigation because there was no sign of a life threat. The sisters, Kelly, and other friends of the missing young woman made the decision to organize their own search effort because they believed that the young woman had simply left for a few days without warning, contrary to what the investigators thought. They started printing flyers with details about Amy and putting them up around the city. Soon after, a nearby television station stepped in to help them by disseminating news of the young woman's disappearance. All of this resulted in numerous volunteers expressing interest in helping with the search. As they divided into groups, with the help of volunteers, they started scouring the city and the surrounding area, looking through forests, beaches, and abandoned homes, but they were unable to uncover any leads. Before the police finally decided to open an investigation, this went on for 3 days. By then, Amy's disappearance had become a topic of conversation throughout the community, which is thought to have put pressure on the neighborhood police force and caused them to act. Since Sean was the last person to see Amy, they decided to talk to him first. This is where they had their first unsettling experience. The story the man told them was distinct from what Kelly and Kim had previously heard. Sean claimed that he and Amy left the bar and made their way to the beach before deciding to part ways and return home. When he turned around after using the payphone to call the taxi, Amy was not there. He waited for a while before boarding the taxi and leaving for home. The story seemed strange to the investigators. Sean was standing 1 meter away when the young woman vanished from the street in a matter of seconds. Why did she not notice, and why did he also give his friends a different account of what happened? All of this was sufficient cause to begin suspecting Sean. Detectives made the decision to investigate his claims and track down the taxi driver who was supposed to take him home that evening. They were soon successful. The only issue was that his account varied from Sean's 2 other accounts. The taxi driver insisted that he did in fact pick up the young man near the phone booth, but that he had to wake Sean up because he was dozing off on a bench when he got there. At the time, there was no young woman present. On the one hand, this gave the boy an alibi, but on the other, he had, for some reason, given his version of events, which only made the detectives more suspicious. Despite this, there was no proof that he had committed the crime, so the police kept looking for new leads. It had been 10 days since Amy had vanished. Her bank accounts had been completely inactive during that time, which only served to further prove that she had not left on her own accord. When that happened, the citizens of St. Augustine and the police started to wonder if Amy's disappearance might be connected to a different set of horrifying crimes, which are covered in a different video. An unidentified maniac murdered 5 students in Gainesville, which was 120 kilometers away, in August of the same year. The town's residents started to worry that this criminal had relocated there and that they were all in imminent danger. Investigators contacted Gainesville colleagues and started comparing the cases, but soon found that there were numerous inconsistencies. In Amy's case, the police didn't even know if she was still alive or what had happened to her. In addition, at the time of her disappearance, the police had already detained a man who was strongly suspected of being the murderer because a number of important pieces of evidence pointed to him. As a result, the detective soon gave up trying to find a link between those crimes and Amy's disappearance, and the police department offered. When they offered a reward of $10,000 for any information that would help them locate Amy, they received hundreds of tips right away, but the majority of them were fruitless. Anytime the government offers a reward for information, people will make up all kinds of tales in the hopes of receiving a quick check. There were 6 additional potentially significant leads. Many of the witnesses who saw her in the city's various locations also said that she got into a few cars. One call stood out among the rest as being the most intriguing. Amy was allegedly spotted in the city by a man. She was approached by an older vehicle that looked like a Chevrolet Camaro the night she vanished. Inside, there were 2 men. Amy sat in the passenger seat after having a brief conversation with them, and they departed. This was the detective's most comprehensive lead at the time. But something about the witness's conduct worried them. He agreed to go to the station after the call, provided all the information requested, and made an effort to assist, but for some reason the investigators viewed him suspiciously. Detectives referred to their uncertainty as a police instinct and were at a loss for words. The man accepted their offer to submit to a lie detector test in order to validate his testimony. They only questioned him about 2 things: whether he was involved in Amy's disappearance, and whether he could lead investigators to her. The witness gave a negative response, and the polygraph operator found no evidence of lying. Investigators realized that they had credible testimony that could help them locate Amy at last. The police started looking for all vehicles that fit the witness description, confirming the drivers' identities, and examining their alibi sheets for the night the young woman vanished. The detective searched for several weeks, but he never identified a single possible suspect. There haven't been any leads in this case since then. 2 months after Amy vanished, however, a startling call to the police was made on January 1st. Near St. Augustine, a man was strolling his dog. His dog eventually spotted a stack of logs with bricks and began acting strangely, barking and yanking on the leash while attempting to flee. The owner decided to investigate what was upsetting his dog so much and was nearly incoherent when he noticed a skeleton hand poking out from beneath the heap. He dialed 911 right away, and detectives started to remove the body. They were unable to identify her right away due to the high level of decomposition, but one aspect immediately caught their attention: the body was donning a green shirt just like Amy Blunt did the night she was last seen. Disappeared. A sheet was used to cover the body. A more thorough examination by medical professionals revealed that the deceased was a young woman. Her shirt was cut, revealing 5 wounds from sharp objects. 2 significant abrasions were also discovered on the body. Amy's dental records were immediately sent to specialists after investigators developed a suspicion that she was the victim. These specialists quickly verified that it was Amy. The news devastated the young woman's friends and family. Up until the very last moment, they had hoped that Amy returned to them without harm. Now that Amy's body had been found and the police had to look into her murder, they had their first tip: Amy had been partially buried and covered with logs on the edge of a sizable private property. For understandable reasons, they called him in for questioning when they discovered the name of the plot's owner. The man was immediately considered a suspect, but after speaking with him, the detectives started to have doubts about his guilt. First, anyone could walk onto the vast plot of land because there was no fence. Enter it was also home to 2 residential trailers, whose owners paid the landowner rent there. He continued by saying that he frequently had issues with one of the tenants. The police were stunned when they learned his name. The polygraphed witness was the same person. Tim Gatchell, who was 22 years old, was the man. When the man was not at home, the police immediately requested permission to search the residence, and the trailer owner consented. The first thing the police noticed was a sheet that looked remarkably like the one that held Amy's body was wrapped. Upon further search, they discovered long female hair that matched Amy's hair color stuck in a floor exercise machine's mechanism. Additionally, forensic professionals found blood traces in the living room using special chemicals. The house also contained a piece of paper with the name Toby and a phone number on it. The landowner claimed that a man by that name frequently paid a visit to Timothy. The police acknowledged that this individual might also be connected to the homicide and got in touch with him. Toby consented to speak with the investigators and related his tale to them. Toby claims that he and Timothy were driving around town that evening, stopping at various bars, when Amy vanished. They eventually came across Amy on the street by herself. Tim asked Toby to put the car in park. Toby exited the vehicle and approached the girl. She entered the vehicle with them after accepting his invitation to do so. They held a gathering at Timothy's trailer. But Toby's tale began to sound odd, almost like a detective tale. He initially stated that he simply dropped. He later changed his story and claimed that he entered the trailer with them, drank a beer, went to the bathroom, and then left without going into the living room before getting into the car and driving away. Investigators had their doubts about his sincerity. They didn't think Amy would travel at night with 2 enigmatic men to the city's outskirts. She had classes in the morning, and after the bar she was supposed to head to the dorm. Toby appeared to have created his tale. Detectives did not rule out that Timothy and Toby may have actually abducted the young woman on the deserted nighttime street, but they were unable to establish this at this time. In addition, Toby claimed something else during the first week of the investigation. He saw flyers about Amy's disappearance and recognized her. He then asked Timothy what happened that night, and Timothy claimed that he took the young woman to the city center and dropped her off there. And quickly began. Even though his story raised serious doubts, Toby advised him to report this information to the police. In order to apprehend Timothy, the police needed sufficient proof. When they got to his house, the man emerged holding up his hands. He told the investigators the same tale when questioned. He started to flirt with Amy after Toby left, but she turned him down. As a result of his outrage, he chose to drive her back to the city. He borrowed the landowner's car because he didn't have one of his own. Amy allegedly got into another car at the center after being driven there in a pickup truck by Amy, but the detectives quickly realized that this was a lie. They were already aware that the rental pickup truck had 3 flat tires and many months' worth of worn tires at that point. The moment the investigators informed him of it, Timothy felt uneasy. He was asked by the detectives, "Did you kill Amy?" "I don't know," the man said in response. "Apparently so." He started talking about what had happened that night at that point. He claimed he couldn't recall much. He tried to kiss Amy at some point, and the next thing he recalls is her holding a knife. He allegedly tried to take the weapon from her because he was afraid she might attack him. After that, Timothy seemed to have lost consciousness because he had no memory of anything. He claimed that he had experienced this before. Some memories were completely gone for him. When he regained consciousness, he discovered Amy dead on the floor with the knife still in his hand. He decided to dispose of the body out of fear. For the shovel, Timothy went to the storage area and began excavating a hole. Then, after burying Amy there and wrapping her in a sheet, he covered the grave with bricks and logs. He then prayed to God and left the room with his confession in hand to clean up the blood. Murder was alleged against Timothy. Toby was only used as a witness because there was no evidence to back him up. A trial was held on July 15, 1991, where the man hoped to defend himself and escape with a lighter sentence. He intended to use the memory loss narrative and make it appear like self-defense, but everything changed when the prosecutor. Nearly immediately after the prosecution asked for the death penalty and addressed the judge, Timothy stood up and declared he was willing to confess to first-degree murder in exchange for life in prison. The court agreed to these terms after only a brief discussion, and Timothy was given a life sentence. They all harbored resentment toward the person who had taken Amy away from them and wanted him to spend the rest of his life in a prison cell, so Amy's family and friends supported this choice. Despite the fact that Toby was never charged, I wouldn't rule out the possibility that he was directly involved in the murder because his story seemed suspicious. Timothy, who is currently 53 years old, is still incarcerated. Share your opinion on this story in the comments and don't forget to like it. Thanks for watching.